Welcome to Sermon Time with me, your host, Pastor Tony. So glad you joined me today, in for a real treat. Many of you have spoken to me about the encouragement you have been receiving throughout this series on What's New, that we have been on since January, and I am grateful for your feedback. The very purpose of this series was meant to encourage you. Since January, we have been trying to determine just what God meant when He said, "I make all things new." We learned He wants to give us a new heart and put a new spirit within us. He wants to bequeath to us the new earth and an eternal home in the new Jerusalem. He has made provisions to renew His everlasting covenant with us, even when we break it. He gave us a new commandment to love others like He does. Not as a replacement for the other commandments, but as a summary of them, so we would see that love and commandment keeping belong together forever. And we learn that when He wants to make us into one new man, He's talking about one, someone different than who we once were, and two, how we relate to people who are different from us, racially, economically, ethnically, culturally different from us. One new man, all saved under the banner of His love and His personal sacrifice to save us all. All of these are important subjects, and I hope have served as a blessing to you exploring them together. Well, last week we peeked into the subject of new strength, which is something we all need from time to time when we come to the end of ourselves. Today's topic, however, is not only important and encouraging, it's also very urgent, far more urgent than something we are to encounter from time to time. It has to happen more frequently than occasionally. We are now on a subject that is both urgent and important. New mercy. And it comes to us courtesy of Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, in the saddest book in all the Bible, Lamentations. This lamentation, this sad song, this sobbing, wailing lament written after the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar's army, owing to the fact that all Israel, Jeremiah included, had broken their covenant with God and would now go into Babylonian exile. And right in the middle of this sad song, you have these words from the wailing prophet. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. His mercies towards us are not only renewed from generation to generation, like when He renews His covenant with us as a people. They are not just renewed from time to time when we come to the end of our strength and need a pick-me-up from the Lord. They are renewed each and every day, right at the first part of the day. Not just at the end of the day after we have failed in some way, but right at the beginning of the day before we have said one regrettable word, before we have made a single step down our wayward path, before we have entangled ourselves in so much trouble we have no way out. His mercies are renewed morning by morning. I find that very encouraging. We can start each day with a fresh supply of mercy before we do anything requiring it. It's like the Lord is giving us a kiss at the door before we leave our house, and He whispers in our ear, "My mercy goes with you, and when you return, it will be there still for you." We need to take just a moment with this word mercy. It means so many things to so many people. I think it's good to come to a common understanding. Scholars have said, and I agree with them, that mercy is not receiving what we do deserve, unlike grace, which is receiving what we do not deserve. Mercy is not receiving what we do deserve. It's a kind of two-sided coin, and both sides are included in the coin of this Hebrew word for mercy. Chesed. Mercy is needed when things are all wrong, when we have messed up big time, when forgiveness is the only remedy. The unfallen worlds and the unfallen angels know nothing of God's mercy. Mercy has forever resided in the heart of God, but it has never been expressed until a people rebelled against Him, who did not trust His love and wisdom, who abandoned His ways. The Hebrew word for mercy here is chesed, which is translated variously as loyal, carrying out an obligation, faithful, good, gracious, and godly. Here, from the context in Lamentations, it connotes showing oneself kind to those who deserve punishment. In the text, the word is paralleled with compassion. Think of it just for a minute. When Jeremiah is writing this, all of Israel is suffering under the heavy burden of losing their homes, their freedom, seeing family members killed, being forcibly thrown into exile in a foreign land, all their dreams for their children, their hopes of finding a spouse or graduating from college or pursuing a career, all out the window. No hope, no future, nothing but uncertainty and misery. Right in the middle of the realization that all this was lost because they did not listen to the messengers the Lord has sent to steer them away from this disastrous precipice, God reminds them of his mercy. They had no one else to blame but themselves. They had it coming to them for their reckless beliefs and behaviors. They were suffering from the consequences of their own poor decisions. And right in the middle of this lament, the Lord would have them know that it's because of his mercies and his compassion that fail not. They failed him, but he doesn't fail them. They fail not. Because of him, they are not consumed. His mercies are renewed morning by morning. Not a generation from now, not 100 years from now, not in a couple of months. Right now, today, right now, when it is needed most. If you have ever wondered what your standing is with the Lord, you need to understand it has nothing to do with your actions, nothing to do with your spiritual accomplishments. Even the slightest deviation from the right path, even once, is enough to destroy life and hope and promise forever. Your standing with God, though, has everything to do with the fact that he is faithful to you, loyal to you, has a sense of obligation to you, gracious to you, good to you, godly, only, always, ever godly to you. He is bound by a covenant that he has no intention of breaking because of who he is. He is merciful. Your standing with God is always secure because every morning he renews his commitment, his mercies towards you. Jeremiah follows this incredibly good news up with the conclusion in verse 24. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. You and I, like Jeremiah and the people of his day, can take hope. Not in our circumstances, not in everything going wrong in our lives, because we have it coming to us. But we can take hope in the Lord. Even though we haven't been, he has remained faithful to the covenant. There is a parallel verse to this in the book of Jeremiah we have to take in right here. Same prophet, same situation in Israel, same exile, same reason, same exact period of time. Jeremiah tells them that throughout their 70-year exile in Babylon, God promises to visit you and perform my good word toward you and cause you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me. Then, he says, while you are in exile, while you are in your problem, while you are suffering under the burden of your well-deserved circumstances, then you will call upon me and go and pray to me, and I will listen to you, and you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. This is the weeping prophet's lament. This, my friends, is as sad as it gets when we search God in our distresses with all our hearts. We will find him, and our prayers will be heard by him, and his mercy will be extended to us because he is always faithful. He will bring us back to his plan A. Plan A, not back to Jerusalem, but back to the new Jerusalem in the new earth. We are exiled on this broken planet. We suffer here. Things are messed up here. This isn't God's plan for us. What is God's plan for us here is to extend his mercy to us, to offer his compassion to us throughout our sojourn here. These are renewed to us every morning, and we can access them every morning to get us through the challenges that each day presents here on the messed up planet. The planet none of us asked to be born into, but, well, here we are. The unfallen worlds understand God's goodness. They know all about his faithfulness, his constant care and love for them. They have seen him in action over and over and over again. But on a personal level, they know nothing about God's mercy or his compassion. Those are reserved for us. And the supply is abundant. Listen to Paul describe just how abundant God's mercy is in Romans chapter 5, verse 20. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. Paul says here that God's law serves a single purpose, to point out when we messed up. And that only accentuates our sense of guilt. Through the law of God, our offense abounded. But, don't you like that word? Especially when it follows such a sentence as, the law entered that the offense might abound. But, where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. Now, I'm going to pull the curtain back on this word abound, because what Paul wrote was, where sin superabounded, where sin took off in our lives like a hypersonic missile, where sin began to multiply in our lives totally out of control like a pandemic. It was then that grace super abounded. That's the literal expression Paul used here. Sin abounded, but grace super abounded. In other words, no matter how out of control our sin has become in our lives, God's grace outpaces it 1,000 to 1. Get out your darkest palette and paint your worst picture. Color it with the most horrid acts of sin and violence and selfishness and impurity and disrespect and greed and whatever else you've got on your palette. Paint your worst picture. And I guess you could say sin has abounded. But the good news is that in that very place, in that very heart, in that very life where sin abounded, God's grace has much more abounded. God too has a palette, and you will find that he paints right over your picture, and he dominates the canvas. God's grace has abounded much more. And folks, that has abounded much more is in the past tense. God's mercies are determined towards you ahead of time, before they are needed, before we do anything bad whatsoever. His mercy is already offered to us in overabundant supply every morning. My mother was merciful like that to me. I can remember one night, right at the end of winter break, the day before school was to start up again, suddenly remembering that I had a huge history project due. And the realization hit me like a freight train because I hadn't really begun it. I was filled with so much anxiety, I screamed. My mother heard my cry and asked what was going on, so I spilled the beans to her. I told her exactly what was going on. And this is what she said to me. Well, you know, Tony, you are allowed to make 3 mistakes every year, and that's your second one. I kid you not. That is exactly what she told me. And I can remember thinking, what was my first mistake? This is like January 3rd. Does that mean I have 362 days left to this year and I only get one more mistake? Who made this stupid rule up anyway? Needless to say, her words were no comfort to me whatsoever in my troubled state. I put her silly ideas out of my mind and focused on the task at hand, a sleepless night spent in getting the project done to the best of my ability under the constraints my procrastinating habits allotted me. I got the project done, such as it was, and wouldn't you know it, it wasn't even a month later I used up my last mistake. I broke my mind to my mom and waited for her pre-programmed reply, already knowing what she was going to say. And right on cue, she said, "Well, Tony, you know you're only allowed 3 mistakes every year." And I was like, yeah, I know. And braced myself for what she was duty-bound to say next. And then she said, "And this is your second one." I remember thinking to myself, hallelujah, my mother doesn't know how to count. Or maybe she just forgot which mistake I was on. And maybe Alzheimer's must be setting in a little early for her. But then I realized what she really meant. We are only allowed 3 mistakes every year. And we are always on the second one. We live on the planet where people are born into sin. We are pre-programmed to sin. We are predisposed to it. It is inevitable that we will sin. And if it weren't for God, we would always sin. This planet would be a horrible place to live. I mean, it's bad enough, but it would be even worse because every intent of the thoughts of our hearts would be only evil continually, like in Noah's day. No one would ever get it right. When life's circumstances called for a merciful action, everyone would always do the worst possible thing. But it is right here in the thick of this planet's sickening problem, we are all under a promise where sin abounds, grace much more abounds. The mercy and the grace we need to show up will always be here for us. And for this we attribute any good that ever happens upon this sin-sick world. It is, if it weren't for his mercy towards us, we would never be merciful toward each other. I hope you're finding true what Paul found to be true. God's grace is sufficient for you. Since mercy and grace outpace our sin, since they super hyper abound toward us, the sinful race, they are enough. There's one more thing I'd like to milk from this word mercy. This is not an attitude of mercy. It is the action of mercy that the Hebrew word is expressing. The Bible tells us elsewhere that God is merciful. He has an attitude of mercy toward us. It's who he is, and there's no changing that. This is why when one enters the most holy place of the sanctuary, they were confronted with the mercy seat. It is the very foundation of his throne. It is his foremost characteristic. But the Hebrew word chesed is in our text in Lamentations today. It's different. It represents all the Lord does because he is merciful. It is about God acting toward us mercifully because he is so merciful. So it isn't true what many believe about God, that he is up in heaven, arms crossed, waiting for us to get our act together so we can approach him and encounter his merciful nature begrudgingly. And it isn't even that he is extending his arms to us in an open-ended invitation. His sleeves are rolled up. His hands are already in the muck of our life, and he is actively forming us back into his image. So, church, I honestly do not know how to encourage you further. I sincerely hope your heart is full of the goodness of God towards you, and that whenever guilt seems to get the best of you, that you will avail yourself to the sufficient, hyper-abounding, never-ending, renewed every morning, awesome mercy of God. Until next week, God bless you.